When we hear the word gospel, we often think of a book, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. But the word itself is far older than the pages that carry it, and far richer than we might imagine. Gospel was never meant to be just a title. It was an announcement, a message worth running to deliver, a truth so good that it changed the meaning of history itself. To understand the Gospels, we must first understand the word gospel, where it came from, what it meant in the ancient world, and why early Christians used it to describe the story of Jesus Christ. Welcome to Stories of the Saints, where history becomes hope, and the lives of the saints reveal eternal truths for our world today. The word gospel did not begin as a religious term. Long before it appeared in the New Testament, it belonged to the everyday language of the ancient world. In English, the word likely comes from the Anglo-Saxon godspell, meaning good story or good telling. But this English form mirrors something even older. The Greek word in Greek, evangelion, originally referred to the reward given to a messenger who brought good news. Over time, the meaning shifted from the reward itself to the joyful message being announced. It was used for news of victories, the birth of an heir, or the rise of a new ruler. It was not quiet information, it was public proclamation. When early Christians adopted this word, they did so deliberately. They were not simply recording events. They were announcing something momentous. The gospel was the good news that God had acted in history through Jesus Christ. It was the declaration that sin and death had been confronted, that salvation had entered the world, and that hope was no longer distant. At first, the gospel was spoken, not written. It was preached in homes, whispered in times of persecution, proclaimed in marketplaces and assemblies. Only later did the gospel take written form, becoming what we now call the four Gospels. These writings, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are records of Christ's words and deeds, but they are rooted in the living proclamation that came before them. This is why we speak of the gospel in the singular and the gospels in the plural. There is one gospel, one good news, but for inspired witnesses to it. Each gospel tells the same saving story from a distinct perspective, shaped by its audience, its theology, and its emphasis. Together, they do not compete. They harmonize. The Latin word evangelium, drawn directly from the Greek, carried this meaning into the Western Church and into modern European languages. Whether spoken in Greek, Latin, or English, the word retained its core identity: a message of joy, victory, and divine intervention. To call the story of Jesus a gospel was a bold claim. It meant that his life, death, and resurrection were not merely events to be remembered, but news that demanded response. The gospel was not written to sit quietly on a shelf. It was meant to be heard, believed, and lived. In this sense, the Gospels are more than historical records. They are the written form of an announcement that continues to echo across centuries, the good news that changed the world. At first glance, the titles of the four Gospels seem obvious and unquestioned. The Gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They appear so natural to us that we rarely stop to ask a simple question: who gave them these names and when? Surprisingly, the evangelists themselves probably did not. The earliest copies of these sacred books did not leave the hands of their authors with formal titles attached. Like many ancient historical works, the Gospels were originally anonymous. They told the story of Christ's life, words, death, and resurrection, without introducing themselves with a signature or a heading. In the ancient world, history did not need a name on the cover. The facts were considered a shared treasure of the community. Unlike letters or prophecies, which depended on the authority of a known writer, history belonged to everyone. So the first Christians did not say, "I am reading Matthew's book," or "Pass me Mark's account." Instead, they simply heard the gospel, the one good news proclaimed about Jesus Christ. But as time passed, something changed. By the 2nd century, many written accounts of Christ's life began to circulate. Some were faithful and trustworthy. Others were confused, exaggerated, or even misleading. Suddenly, it mattered very much which account a believer was using. The church needed a way to distinguish the authentic apostolic traditions from unreliable ones. This is when the familiar titles began to appear. Historical witnesses from the late 2nd century, such as the Canon of Clement of Alexandria and Saint Irenaeus, show that these headings were already well established in their day. They refer casually to the Gospels according to Matthew, according to Mark, and so on, as if everyone already recognized these names. That casual usage tells us something important. The titles had likely been in circulation for quite some time before they wrote, probably reaching back to the early part of the 2nd century. Yet scholars generally agree they probably do not go all the way back to the 1st century or to the evangelists themselves. One clue is their similarity. All 4 titles follow the same pattern: euangelion, kata, gospel according to. Since the books were written at different times and places, it is unlikely each author independently chose the exact same formula. More likely, the titles were added when the 4 Gospels were gathered together as a collection, giving each its identifying label. Notice something else subtle but important. The phrase does not say the Gospel of Matthew. It says the Gospel according to Matthew. That wording is deliberate. It reflects a profound theological idea. There are not 4 different Gospels. There is only one Gospel, one saving message, one good news of Jesus Christ. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not presenting competing stories. They are 4 witnesses, 4 voices, 4 perspectives, telling the same truths. It is one gospel, told according to Matthew, one gospel according to Mark, one gospel according to Luke, one gospel according to John. The unity of the message mattered more than the individuality of the writer. At the heart of every title stands the word euangelion, gospel. In the New Testament, this word first meant simply good news, specifically the good news of God's kingdom and salvation. It described the living proclamation preached by the apostles long before anything was written down. For years, perhaps decades, Christians spoke the gospel, taught the gospel, and lived the gospel without possessing a single gospel book. The gospel was a message before it was a manuscript. Only later, when written records were composed to preserve that message faithfully, did the word slowly take on a second meaning. It began to refer not just to the announcement of salvation, but also to the books that contained that announcement. We see this shift clearly in the 2nd century when St. Justin Martyr speaks of the memoirs of the apostles, which are called Gospels. Here, for the first time, the word refers unmistakably to physical texts. By then, the transition was complete. What once meant solely the preached good news now also meant the written testimony that safeguarded it. So the titles of the Gospels tell a quiet but beautiful story. They remind us that these books were not created as isolated biographies or personal memoirs. They grew out of the living faith of the Church. The message came first. The books followed. The proclamation came first. The parchment came later. And when the Church finally named them, she did so carefully, preserving both unity and memory, one gospel, faithfully handed down, according to those who first bore witness. In this way, even the titles themselves preach theology. They whisper what the early Christians believed. Not for stories, not for messages, but one saving truth, told through 4 faithful voices. When we read the titles of the 4 Gospels, we tend to glide past a small, almost invisible word without giving it much thought. According to the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Luke, the Gospel according to John. It feels like a simple phrase, almost decorative. But this little preposition kata in Greek carries a meaning that quietly shapes how we understand the entire New Testament. For centuries, scholars have asked, what exactly does according to mean here? Does it mean written by, or does it mean something softer? Something like in the tradition of, or based on the teaching of? At first glance, the question might sound technical, but it touches something deeper. Who actually stands behind these books? Are these simply anonymous accounts later linked to famous names? Or are they truly the work of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John themselves? Some early interpreters thought kata did not strictly indicate authorship. They suggested it meant drawn up according to the viewpoint of. In other words, the gospel wouldn't necessarily be written by Matthew himself, but would reflect Matthew's teaching or tradition, much like other ancient works called the Gospel according to the Hebrews, or according to the Egyptians, which referred not to authors, but to communities that preserved a certain version of the story. In this view, the titles would function more like labels of authority or tradition rather than signatures. But most scholars have found this explanation incomplete, because when you look closely at the early church's beliefs, something doesn't quite fit. If the titles were only meant to identify the ultimate authority behind the teaching, then the naming of the Gospels would likely have followed a different logic. For example, early Christians believed that Mark wrote under Peter's guidance and Luke wrote under Paul's influence. So if authority alone were the point, we might expect to see titles like the Gospel according to Peter, the Gospel according to Paul. But we don't. Instead, we consistently see Mark and Luke named directly. This strongly suggests something more personal and concrete. Authorship. The Gospels are not just traditions floating around under an apostle's shadow. They are deliberate written works connected to specific individuals. Yet there is still something unique about the way that authorship is expressed. Here's where it gets interesting. When the New Testament names other books, it uses a different grammatical form. For example, the letters of Paul to Apocalypse of John. These titles use the possessive form. The genitive case simply meaning Paul's letters or Johnny's revelation. It's straightforward ownership, but the Gospels don't use that form. They don't say Matthew's Gospel. Instead, they say the Gospel according to Matthew. That difference is not accidental. It suggests something subtle but beautiful. The early church did not think there were 4 separate Gospels in the sense of 4 different messages. There was only one Gospel, one good news of salvation, one story of Christ's life, death, and resurrection. What Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John provided were not 4 different Gospels, but foretellings of the same Gospel. 4 witnesses, 4 portraits, 4 ways of setting down the same saving truth. So kata does more than say written by. It means something closer to the Gospel as told by Matthew, the Gospel as presented by Mark, the Gospel in the form recorded by Luke, the Gospel as witnessed by John. It points to authorship. Yes, but authorship that serves a shared message. The focus is not on the writer's ownership. The focus is on the one story they all share. Think of it like 4 artists painting the same sunrise. Each canvas is different colors, different emphasis, different angles, but the sun is the same sun. The light is the same light. So too with the Gospels. Matthew writes with the language of prophecy and fulfillment. Mark moves quickly, urgently, with action and immediate. Luke tells the story with careful history and compassion. John soars into theology and mystery. 4 styles, 4 voices, 1 Christ. And that is exactly what the little word kata protects. It prevents us from thinking the Gospel belongs to Matthew or Mark as private property. Instead, it reminds us that the Gospel belongs to the church too. The world, and each evangelist simply hands it on in his own faithful way. Intis sensei, even the grammar teaches theology. The titles quietly proclaim, there are not 4 Gospels. There is 1 Gospel told 4 times. And every time we open one of those books, we are not reading a different message. We are hearing the same good news, spoken through a different witness, according to the voice God chose to use. Today, when someone says the Gospels, we instinctively think of 4 books: Mark, Luke, and John. 4 names, 4 stories, 4 witnesses. It feels settled, obvious, unquestionable. But in the earliest centuries of Christianity, things were not nearly so simple. Because the truth is this: the early Christian world had far more than 4 Gospels. Not 4, not 10, but dozens. From the very beginning, the life of Jesus stirred extraordinary fascination. People wanted to know everything: his words, his miracles, his childhood, his hidden years, his death, his resurrection. Communities treasured every memory and every story. As Christianity spread across cities and cultures, many believers tried to put those memories into writing. So narratives multiplied. Some were careful, some were imaginative, some were devotional, some were wildly legendary. By the time Luke began writing his Gospel, he openly acknowledged this reality. In his prologue, it tells us that many have undertaken to compile accounts of Christ's life before him. Luke was not writing into an empty field, he was entering a crowded one. Over the next centuries, even more works appeared. Titles alone suggest the sheer scale of this enthusiasm. Scholars have identified the names of nearly 50 different writings that called themselves Gospels. Of these, we have at least some knowledge of about 20, and their names read like a catalog of forgotten history. The Gospel according to the Hebrews, the Gospel of Peter. The Gospel according to the Egyptians, the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Philip. The Gospel of Matthias, the Protevangelium of James. The Gospel of Judas, and many others. At first glance, it can feel confusing, even unsettling. If there were so many Gospels, why do we only have 4 in the Bible? Or the others hidden, lost, suppressed? The answer is actually simpler and far less dramatic than many modern theories suggest. Most of these other writings were not early eyewitness accounts competing with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In fact, many of them were written much later, sometimes generations or even centuries after the apostles had died. Rather than preserving living memory, they often reflect something else entirely. Imagination, legend, or theological speculation. Some tried to fill in gaps the canonical Gospels leave silently, especially Jesus' childhood. The Protevangelium of James, for example, invents elaborate stories about Mary's early life. Others, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Judas, reflect Gnostic ideas that reinterpret Jesus in mystical or symbolic ways, far removed from the historical setting of first-century Palestine. Instead of sober historical narrative, many read more like spiritual fiction or theological experiments. They often lack connection to eyewitness apostolic, authority, historical grounding, or consistent teaching with the early church. In short, they sound different. While the canonical Gospels speak with a quiet confidence of many places, dates, concrete details, the apocryphal ones often drift into fantasy or secret revelations. Early Christians recognized this difference instinctively. They did not choose 4 Gospels out of dozens at random. Rather, they received 4 that had already proven trustworthy through continuous use in worship, teaching, and apostolic tradition. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were read everywhere in Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, and beyond. They were copied, preached, and defended from the earliest times. They were tied directly to the apostolic circle. Their theology matched what the church had always believed. The others simply didn't carry the same weight. Many appeared too late. Many contradicted known teaching. Many were clearly imaginative expansions rather than authentic testimony. So over time, the church naturally distinguished between the Gospels and the so-called Gospels. 4 stood firm, the rest faded. Not because of conspiracy, but because of credibility. It's a bit like gold among stones. When everything is shaken, the real metal remains. And there is something beautiful about this process. The existence of so many attempted Gospels shows just how deeply Jesus captured the human heart. People couldn't stop talking about him. They couldn't stop writing about him. They wanted more stories, more details, more explanations. But amid all that enthusiasm, only a few accounts proved rooted in truth rather than imagination. So in TN, Christianity did not keep many voices. It kept 4. For that together form one message. For that harmonize rather than compete. For that trace back to those who actually walked with Christ or stood close to those who did. The abundance of other Gospels doesn't weaken the story. If anything, it highlights how remarkable the canonical for really are. Because among dozens of attempts, these alone endured. And for nearly 2,000 years, when Christians say the Gospels, it is still those same 4 voices we mean. Not because they were the only ones written, but because they were the only ones the church recognized as true witnesses to the life of Jesus. Imagine yourself standing in the 2nd century. Christianity is still young. The apostles are gone, or nearly gone. Churches are scattered across Rome, Syria, Egypt, Asia Minor. Stories about Jesus are everywhere. Some are whispered memories, some are letters. Some are scrolls passed from hand to hand, and many writings claim to be Gospels. So a natural question rises: how did the church end up with only 4? Not 5, not 10, not 50. Just 4. And here is the honest truth that historians admit. We cannot reconstruct the exact step-by-step process. There was no dramatic council one morning that said, "These 4 survive, the rest disappear." No sudden vote, no secret selection. Instead, what we find is something quieter and, in many ways, more convincing. We find evidence of recognition, not invention. Because when we look at the earliest Christian voices, the pattern is startlingly consistent. Everywhere we look, it's already 4. Always 4. Never more. Never fewer. By the early 4th century, the church historian Eusebius tried to sort Christian writings into categories. Those universally accepted, those disputed, and those rejected. And when he speaks of the Gospels, he doesn't hesitate. Ecastem, the Holy Quaternion. The sacred group of 4, not a flexible number. Not a growing list, but a fixed foundation. At the same time, he places other writings like the Gospel according to the Hebrews among books that were questioned or doubtful. The difference was already clear. 4 stood firm, the rest hovered on the edges. But we can go even earlier. Much earlier, before Constantine. Before councils, before Christianity had any political power at all. In North Africa, around the year 200, Tertullian constantly quotes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as authoritative scripture. He even mentions an old Latin translation of these same Gospels already in circulation, which means they had been copied and read for generations before him. In Egypt, Clement of Alexandria does the same. He teaches from the same 4 books as if no alternatives even need mentioning. Across the Mediterranean world, different languages, different cultures, different bishops, yet the same 4. This kind of agreement doesn't happen by accident. It suggests something older, something already settled long before these men were born. Then comes one of the most powerful witnesses, Saint Irenaeus, and his testimony feels almost dramatic. Irenaeus was far removed from the apostles themselves. As a young man, he had known Polycarp, and Polycarp had been a disciple of the Apostle John. So we're not talking about distant history. We're only 1 or 2 handshakes away from the eyewitnesses. And what does Irenaeus say? Not only that there are 4 Gospels, but that there must be 4. He even uses symbolic language to describe it. 4 corners of the earth, 4 winds, 4 living creatures in Ezekiel's vision. So, he argues, it is fitting that there be 4 pillars of the Church, 4 Gospels breathing life into the world. Now, his reasoning might sound poetic to modern ears even. A little strange. But that's exactly the point, because you only use symbolic arguments like that when the fact itself is already unquestioned. He wasn't trying to convince people to accept he was assuming everyone already did. The number had become so fixed that he was simply reflecting on its meaning. And that tells us something important. By the late 2nd century, the 4-fold gospel wasn't debated, it was normal. And then we find another fascinating piece of evidence. Tatian, a disciple of Justin Martyr, created a harmonia, single continuous story of Jesus by weaving together the 4 Gospels. But notice what he didn't do. He didn't add the Gospel of Peter. He didn't add Thomas. He didn't add any of the other popular writings. He used only 4, because to him, those were the sources that mattered. Those were the authentic ones. Even Justin himself, writing around AD 145, shockingly early refers to what he calls the Memoirs of the Apostles, read aloud in Christian worship alongside the Old Testament. And when scholars analyze what he quotes, they find something unmistakable. It's Matthew, it's Mark, it's Luke. It's John. And nothing else. Which means that by the middle of the 2nd century, the church was already treating these 4 books as scripture, not as interesting biographies, not as optional stories, but as a creed. What about even earlier? What about the very first Christians? Here things get quieter. In the writings of the Apostolic Fathers, we don't yet see a neat list of 4 named books. But that's perfectly natural, because they lived in the very time when the Gospels were still being written, and the word gospel didn't yet mean a book. It meant the message itself the good news of Christ. So instead of citing the gospel according to Matthew, they simply quoted Jesus' words directly as living tradition. The categories hadn't fully formed yet, but once they did, once written accounts spread and stabilized, the same four emerged everywhere. And this is what makes the story so compelling. The four Gospels weren't forced into place by authority. They rose naturally through use. They were read in churches, copied again and again, trusted, preached, defended, while others slowly faded away. Not because someone banned them, but because they simply didn't carry the same voice of authenticity. It's like a crowd slowly quieting until only the true witnesses remain. And when the dust settled, four voices were still speaking. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. So the real mystery isn't, why only four? The real mystery might be, how did four separate books, written in different places and times, become universally recognized across the entire Christian world so early, so consistently, and so unanimously? Because that kind of agreement doesn't usually come from control. It comes from memory, from trust, from authenticity, from people recognizing the sound of truth. Imagine the early centuries of Christianity not as a quiet library with four neat books on a shelf, but as a crowded marketplace of stories. Everywhere believers gathered, accounts of Jesus were being told, copied, translated, and passed from hand to hand. Some were careful recollections, others were imaginative expansions. Some were faithful, others drifted into legend. By the 2nd century, dozens of writings calling themselves Gospels were circulating among Christian communities. So how did the church recognize only four as truly sacred? The answer becomes clear when you look closely at the character of these books. From the very beginning, the four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, felt different. They did not read like myths or dramatic fantasies. They were strikingly simple. Calm/grounded. Their tone was sober and restrained, almost They told extraordinary events, the blind seeing, the dead rising, Christ himself conquering death, but without exaggeration or spectacle. There were no theatrical flourishes or childish wonders, no sensational magic meant to impress. Instead, they sounded like memory, like testimony, like truth. This simplicity set them apart immediately from many of the apocryphal Gospels, which often drifted into the strange or the absurd. In those writings, the child Jesus might fashion birds from clay and make them fly, or strike playmates dead in fits of anger, or perform miracles that feel more like folklore than faith. Such tales may have satisfied curiosity, but they lacked the spiritual depth and historical seriousness found in the canonical accounts, where the four Gospels were reverent and restrained. Many apocryphal works were fanciful and legendary, but tone was not the only difference. There was also time. The canonical Gospels came earlier, closer to the events they described. They were rooted in the living memory of the apostolic age. Many of the apocryphal writings appeared much later, sometimes generations afterward. In fact, scholars have observed that several of these later Gospels actually borrowed from Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, expanding or altering stories that already existed. In other words, they were not independent witnesses. They were echoes, and echoes can never carry the same authority as the original voice. Then there was doctrine. The four canonical Gospels preserved a clear, consistent teaching about Christ's identity, his mission, his call to repentance, his moral demands, and his saving work. Their theology was unified, pure, and in harmony with the faith preached by the apostles. By contrast, many apocryphal Gospels were shaped by particular sects or fringe groups. Some reflected Gnostic ideas that denied Christ's true humanity. Others mixed Christian teaching with strange philosophies or secret hidden knowledge. Some leaned toward extreme Jewish or mystical interpretations. These writings often supported the beliefs of small splinter communities rather than the universal church. So while heretical groups embraced them, the wider Christian body recognized that something was wrong. These texts did not sound like the faith handed down from the apostles. They felt foreign, distorted, unreliable. Finally, and most importantly, there was the question of authority. The church did not simply ask, "Is this interesting? Or is this popular?" She asked, "Does this come from the apostles?" Because Christianity was built on apostolic witness. 2 of the canonical Gospels were directly attributed to apostles themselves, Matthew and John. The other 2, Mark and Luke, were closely connected to the great apostolic leaders. Mark wrote what he learned from Peter. Luke wrote what he received from Paul and other eyewitnesses. So all 4 stood firmly within the circle of apostolic testimony. They were not second-hand legends. They were rooted in the very men who walked with Christ. Many apocryphal Gospels try to claim apostolic names: Thomas, Peter, Philip, Judas, but these claims were rarely convincing and never universally accepted. Early Christians were cautious. They knew the difference between genuine tradition and later inventions, wearing famous names like disguises. Only one non-canonical Gospel ever gained even partial respect: the Gospel according to the Hebrews. Some early Christians read it, and St. Jerome even thought it might preserve an early Hebrew version of Matthew. But even this text never stood beside the 4. It was never granted equal authority, never treated as another pillar of the faith. At best, it was considered secondary, a curiosity, not a foundation. And so, over time, a clear pattern emerged. The 4 canonical Gospels endured because they carried the ring of truth, the sobriety of history, the purity of doctrine, the closeness of apostolic memory, and the universal acceptance of the Church. The others faded because they lacked these marks. What survived was not decided by politics or accident, but by authenticity. The Church recognized the voices that sounded like the apostles and quietly set aside the rest. In the end, the difference is almost poetic. The canonical Gospels feel like eyewitnesses speaking softly but confidently. "This is what we saw. This is what we heard." The apocryphal Gospels often sound like distant storytellers trying to embellish the tale. And when it comes to the life of Christ, believers trusted the witnesses, not the rumors. That is why, out of dozens of competing narratives, only 4 have stood the test of centuries. 4 pillars holding up the memory of Jesus, steady and unshaken, from the 1st century to today. At first glance, the order of the 4 Gospels in your Bible feels so natural that you might assume it has always been that way. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. It rolls off the tongue like something fixed and inevitable, as if the Church received them in that exact sequence from the very beginning. But history tells a far more interesting story. In the early centuries of Christianity, while believers everywhere agreed on one crucial fact, that only 4 Gospels were truly canonical, they did not always agree on how those 4 should be arranged. In fact, early Christian lists and writers preserve no fewer than 8 different orders. 8. That alone tells us something important. The Church did not see the order as divinely dictated. It was practical, historical, and symbolic. Something shaped by memory, tradition, and purpose, rather than strict rule. And those variations are surprisingly revealing. The biggest shifts usually involved St. John. Sometimes John appears last, as we know him today. Sometimes he moves to 3rd, sometimes 2nd. In a few early arrangements, he even stands 1st. Meanwhile, Mark and Luke quietly trade places. Luke is often placed before Mark, likely because his Gospel is longer and perhaps felt more substantial. At other times, Luke follows immediately after Mark so that his Gospel would sit next to Acts, the 2nd volume traditionally attributed to him. So the early Church wasn't randomly rearranging books. There were reasons, thoughtful, meaningful reasons behind every placement. Still, among all these variations, one order slowly rose above the rest and became dominant. The order we use today: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And this arrangement turns out to be the most ancient and most widely supported. It appears in some of the earliest and most authoritative Christian witnesses: the Canon of Maratory, Saint Irenaeus, Saint Athanasius, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, the councils of Laodicea and Carthage, and even in the oldest surviving Greek manuscripts, the Vatican Synoptic and Alexandrian codices. When St. Jerome prepared the Latin Vulgate, he preserved this same order, and from there it passed into nearly every modern Bible. But why this sequence? Why this order, and not another? The answer likely lies in something beautifully simple: time. The early church seems to have arranged the Gospels according to the traditional dates of their composition. Matthew first. Very early tradition held that Matthew wrote his Gospel in Hebrew or Aramaic for Jewish Christians in Palestine, because it was directed to believers closest to the original events. Before the Gospel had spread widely into the Greek-speaking world, it was considered the earliest account, so naturally, it was given pride of place. Then came Mark and Luke. Both were seen as belonging to the next stage of the church's life. When the message was spreading outward, Mark, the companion of Peter, and Luke, the companion of Paul, were not apostles themselves, but they wrote under apostolic guidance. Their Gospels, therefore, were understood as coming after Matthew but before the final witness. And finally, John. From very early times, Christians believed John wrote last, long after the others, offering a deeper, more reflective account of Christ's life. His gospel reads like the memory of an old apostle, looking back after decades of prayer and contemplation. Because of this late date, his work naturally closed the collection. So the order quietly tells a story. First, an apostle writing, early Matthew. Then, to close companions, preserving apostolic preaching, Mark and Luke. Finally, another apostle writing, last John. It creates a kind of frame. Apostle at the beginning, apostle at the end. Disciples of apostles in the middle. It's almost architectural, like pillars, supporting the whole structure. But what about the other orders that circulated? Those, too, make sense once you understand the context. Remember, in many places the four Gospels were copied and circulated separately. Churches didn't always receive them as one bound volume like we do today. When they gathered books together for reading and worship, they might arrange them according to local priorities. Some communities placed the two apostles first, Matthew and John, simply to honor apostolic authority more directly. Others paired Matthew with Mark and John with Luke to reflect relationships between teachers and disciples. Some grouped Luke next to Acts so that readers could move seamlessly from the life of Christ to the history of the early church. In other words, these orders were often pastoral or practical choices rather than theological statements. And that's part of what makes this history so human and fascinating. It reminds us that the Bible didn't drop from heaven already. Typeset and bound. It grew organically within living communities. Copied, arranged, read aloud, and cherished by real believers. Making thoughtful decisions, yet through all that variety, one thing never changed. There were always four, not three, not five, not dozens. No matter the order, the church's memory was unwavering. Four and only four, authentic witnesses to Christ's life. The sequence could shift, but the number never did, and that consistency speaks volumes. So the next time you open your Bible and see Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John lined up in their familiar places, remember that order carries centuries of tradition behind it. It reflects how early Christians understood history, authority, and memory. It quietly traces the timeline of the Gospels spread from Jerusalem to the world. It isn't just a table of contents. It's a story about how the church remembered. If you open the New Testament and glance at the first four books, you might not immediately notice anything unusual about their arrangement. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John simply follow one another, as though they have always belonged in that exact sequence. But that order is not accidental. In fact, it quietly reveals something important about how the church has long understood these sacred writings. The present arrangement of the Gospels does more than list four biographies of Christ. It actually helps us see that they naturally fall into two distinct groups. On the one hand, there are three Gospels that seem to move together almost like close companions. On the other, there is one that stands apart, different in tone, style, and structure. And this difference is so clear that scholars eventually gave them names. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels. John is something else entirely. The word synoptic comes from two Greek roots, meaning to see together. It's a wonderfully descriptive term. These three Gospels can literally be placed side by side, and their similarities become immediately visible. If you line them up in parallel columns, you can watch the same stories unfold almost in step with each other. The same miracles, the same parables, the same journeys, often even the same wording. It's almost like hearing the same story told by three eyewitnesses, standing shoulder to shoulder. You read about the feeding of the 5,000 in Matthew, then you find it again in Mark, and again in Luke. You hear the parable of the sower, the calming of the storm, the confession of Peter, the transfiguration, the passion narrative repeated across all three, sometimes so closely matched that whole sentences appear nearly identical. This creates a fascinating effect. The three Gospels seem woven together. They share a common framework, a similar timeline, and a comparable way of presenting Jesus' ministry. They move largely from Galilee to Jerusalem. They emphasize his teaching in parables, his miracles among the crowds, his very human presence walking dusty roads with his disciples. Because of this strong resemblance, scholars realize these three belong naturally in one family. They can be seen together, compared together, even harmonized together, almost like three synchronized lenses focused on the same scene. That is why the current order of the New Testament makes so much sense. By placing Matthew, Mark, and Luke next to one another, it allows readers to notice their shared character. The grouping isn't random, it helps you feel their unity. But then you reach John, and suddenly, the rhythm changes. If the first three feel like three parallel accounts of the same journey, John feels like stepping into a different room entirely. It's not that John contradicts the others. Rather, he approaches the story from another angle, deeper, more reflective, more theological. While the Synoptics often sound like reporters carefully recording events, John sounds like a theologian meditating on their meaning. The differences become obvious almost immediately. The Synoptics begin with Jesus' birth or baptism. John begins before creation itself. In the beginning was the Word. The Synoptics tell many short parables. John records long, profound discourses. The Synoptics focused heavily on Galilee. John spends much more time in Judea and Jerusalem. Many beloved synoptic scenes. The parable of the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, the transfiguration, never appear in John. And many of John's most famous episodes, the wedding at Cana, the raising of Lazarus, the washing of the disciples' feet, the extended farewell discourse, appear nowhere in the Synoptics. Even the language feels different. Where the first three often present brief sayings and vivid actions, John lingers on symbolism. Light and darkness, life and death, bread and water, vine and branches. His gospel feels less like a simple chronicle and more like a meditation written after many years of prayer and reflection. So while the first three gospels can be easily arranged side by side and compared line by line, John resists that kind of harmony. You cannot neatly fit him into the same chart. His narrative simply doesn't follow the same pattern. And because of this, the Church has long recognized that John stands in a class of his own, not separate in authority. All four are equally sacred, but separate in character. If the Synoptics give us the broad landscape of Jesus' life, John takes us inside the mystery of who he is. If the Synoptics show us what Jesus did, John asks us what it means. Together, they complement each other beautifully. The three give us breadth. The fourth gives us depth. The three show us the steps of Christ's ministry. The fourth opens the heart of Christ himself. And suddenly, the order of the Gospels feels almost poetic. First, the shared witness. Matthew, Mark, Luke. Three voices speaking in harmony. Then, at the end, the contemplative voice of John, like a final, lingering note that invites you to go deeper. It's not merely an arrangement of books. It's a journey. You begin by walking with Jesus through towns and villages. You end by contemplating the eternal Word made flesh. So the classification of the Gospels isn't just a scholarly label. It is a way of understanding how the Church has always read these texts, together and yet distinct, harmonious and yet unique. Four witnesses, three closely united, one standing apart, all telling the same truth, but each in a voice that only it can give. Before a single gospel shaped the world. If this story strengthened your faith, please like, share, and subscribe to Stories of the Saints so more souls can discover the lives that changed history.